All right, we're live on YouTube.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have Vicky yet?
No.
Okay, I'll give another minute. We'll wait for Vicky.
Michael is here.
And we have Janae is not going to join us. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and get started? So I'll call the meeting to order. And Nanette, will you please take the roll?
Yes. Mary Kate Mirren,
Present.
Max Starks,
Present.
Vicki Krause, Maurice Lindsay,
Present.
Jeff Sattler,
Present.
and Janae McDonald. No. We do have a quorum with 4.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nay. I appreciate
You're
that. So before we jump right in, why don't I just kind of recap why we're having this special meeting. So we had our meeting, our normally scheduled meeting last week, where we were going over the fiscal year 2022 budget and started talking through some of the additional COVID fund applications. And we got ourselves caught up between approving the budget and making decisions or providing recommendations and asking questions and getting answers to kind of the COVID related items. And it took us away from the primary focus, which was really on the 2022 budget, which we'll go through here today with a motion. And then we'll also have the auditors here to kind of answer some of our questions around the separate COVID funding questions that we have. But again, I want to make sure that we're clear on the separation between 2022 budget and how we potentially can apply COVID funding. So with that, Dr. Cook, a consideration of fiscal year 2022 budget.
Yes, real brief, and thank you again, everyone. Appreciate the time a week later. And again, my appreciation, even though they're the second item, to O'Connor and Drew. I see Michael Cosgrove, who's been with us consistently for a number of years. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it, and we look forward to that conversation. I think for Trustee Starks and trustees tonight, I just wanted to say how tremendous it's been that our team, so Andrea Nathanson as our CFO, Dorothy Unger, who steady reins on that controller position. We've got John Tudrin, who's coming in, Jason Cohen, our senior director of budget. They have been tremendous in helping develop and now have this budget for next year in front of you. I know we did the student fee freeze last week. That is greatly appreciated. I think, again, that puts us in good company as a college with that work. And again, I'll turn it over to Andrea to walk you through this, but there's just so much, I think, to be appreciative of, and I just wanted to express that to the committee, knowing how much work has really gone in by Andrea and her team to help shape, again, a budget that's going to carry some uncertainty, but is absolutely a great budget for you all to be taking a look at tonight. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Cook.
So if we can go to maybe the next slide. So thanks everyone for taking the time for this special meeting. And given the fact that at the last meeting, we did go through some of the budget slides and we did look at some of the changes from draft to draft. What I wanted to do tonight is to really just make sure that this, final version of the budget presentation has all the key information in it. So I'm not going to go through all the details again, but just want to make sure that everyone's got a good kind of sense of the picture of this budget. So here we have the key assumptions. So just as a reminder, on the revenue side, we're assuming that the state appropriation is flat to FY21. We're assuming enrollment will be down 7.6% from 21 projected, which at this point seems somewhat optimistic, but that's where we are right now. And the financial magnitude of that reduction is $3.7 million of down from the FY21 budget and $1.5 million down from the FY21 projection. As we already said, there's a freeze on student fees. So those are really the main assumptions on the revenue side. On the expense side, we have full-time staff at 371 FTEs. Part-time salaries are down a bit, reflecting the assumed enrollment decline. We have salary increases in the budget for the union contracts, the small placeholder for NUP increases. Operational expenses are essentially flat to the 21 budget and increased about 700,000 over the 21 projection due to the expectation of more activity on campus next year. And again, the facilities capital is the usual $3.1 million with an addition of IT capital of 1.7 million per the 5-year IT plan that Mary presented at a previous meeting. And again, with the baseline budget being having a deficit of $5.1 million, we're using federal COVID relief funding to bridge the gap between the baseline budget and a balanced budget. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So this is, you have this in your packet. This is the detailed budget, very hard to read here, but just so we know, in column 2, that's the baseline budget with the $5.1 million deficit. And then column 3 has the budget that's being presented with a balanced budget. If we go to the next slide, this will sort of summarize the numbers for us. So here we see the baseline budget with the $5.1 million deficit. When we use allowable uses of the federal COVID relief funding, we're adding in another 5.1 million net. And so the budget we're presenting to you here is balanced with revenue and expense each at $55 million. If we go to the next slide, please, thank you. This is for anyone who's interested in understanding what has changed between the 22 budget and either the 21 budget or the 21 projection. On the left, we have the crosswalk from the 21 budget to the 22 budget. And on the right, we have the crosswalk from the 21 projection to the 22 budget. So the most important numbers here are highlighted. Again, the big differences are in student tuition and fee revenue, which is really based on enrollment changes. If we kind of jump to the bottom, we have the IT capital projects budget of 1.7 million, which, by the way, about $1 million of that will be funded by COVID funding. And then we have a big change between the 21 actual and 22 budget, the $2.3 million in the full-time salary line item, which is really related to positions that have been vacant throughout this year and are expected to be filled next year. And then some operational increases based on restoring activity on campus. So again, there are some more details here. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I just really wanted everyone to understand what the big impact factors are in this budget. If we could go
Andrea,
on to
question for you. So back on the prior slide, you had mentioned the 371 FTEs assumed in the fiscal year 22 budget. How many are included in 2021's projection?
in 2021 projection, it doesn't quite work that way because we've had vacancies. So, if you were to take, like, all the positions exist now. So the positions that are in the budget for next year exist in the budget this year, but they're not necessarily all filled, if that makes sense. So we have expenses that are missing, even though there's a position.
Yeah, so, right, so the position, well, I guess it comes to actual comp. So how many FTEs are we paying in 2021's projection versus the 371 that we're presuming to be paying in 22?
That's something we would have to calculate. I don't have that number. But
Okay.
we could get that for you.
Okay. You spiked it out as a assumption. Just curious why, what the relative change is, but okay, we can get that later.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it was less about the change and more about just an understanding of how many full-time positions we have.
Yep, I'm with you. It's only relevant though if you know what it's to from. But anyways, okay, let's move forward.
Okay. So if we go to the next slide, please. We've looked at this slide a few times. It's really, I'm not going to go through the details again. This really is showing how the revenue and the expenses sort of stack up by category. And again, a reminder that, we're relying on the COVID relief funds of $5.1 million to balance the budget. And if we can just go to the next slide, and this is really kind of wrapping things up on the budget. Again, just the biggest risk item in this budget is enrollment. And, so at this point, we're assuming a 7.6% decline in enrollment from FY21. When IR presented to this committee, I think a couple months ago, their worst case scenario was 16% down. And so just as an example, the value of the difference between the 16% and the 7.6% down is about 1.4 million. So, if we get to fall and we haven't made up some of that enrollment, that's when we'll need to revisit the assumptions in the budget and, talk about whether we need to access reserves or cut expenses, if the revenue is substantially less than what we're looking at here. But it's very, very early to determine that right now.
Right. And Andrew, sorry, Matt,
Go
just a quick,
ahead.
quick question on that, Andrea. So refresh my memory, the majority of registrations are complete. Is that 3 weeks prior to the start of the fall? Is that correct? Around that time? Dr. Cook, do you have that or somebody?
Mary Kay, can you share that question again?
Yeah,
Sorry.
so the majority of registrations for the fall, what's the time frame does that happen? Is that 3-4 weeks prior to the start of the school year? Just so we get a sense of timing.
Got it, sure. So July 1st, typically we have about 50% of our enrollment before and then 50% after. The number that Geraldine DeBurley, our VP of Academics, has shared is 2 weeks prior to the start of the semester. We sometimes see as much as 15% of our enrollment right in those 2 weeks prior. So this is what community college offer in terms of access, right? Is all the way to the day before the semester starts, you can register. And we do see a pretty large number. So, right, we won't really know where we land, honestly, actually, until add drop, which is 2 weeks after the start of the semester.
Yeah, I think, we talked, and I apologize for missing the last meeting, but I think we talked about how important, right, this marketing, we've got to keep an eye on enrollments. And if there's something that we need to pull the trigger, we're just going to need to do that to make sure this budget stays in line. And apologies for our Mac cutting you off.
No problem. No worries.
And obviously, we'll be digging into that with trustees because for us, what we track, right, is both the recruitment, so new students, but also retention. And we certainly have everything that we pull out of the woodwork, right, to try to draw our current students to still stay with us. And that's often a larger proposition and a position in our enrollment than even the recruitment, the marketing pieces.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks for that. So my question is going to be, so anything can happen, but based on your worst case, are you saying that $1.4 million might be the additional gap we may see if we do go from the 7.6% decline assumed to 16%?
So in this scenario, so let me just say that I don't know if that is the worst case. That was the worst case that was presented a couple months ago. I'm not going to commit to that being the potential worst case, but
that's why I started saying that if based upon this, and like I said, anything can happen. But in your analysis, if your worst case comes out to be 16%, are you saying that that's a $1.4 million expected additional gap? That's the question.
Exactly. Yes.
Thank you.
And just to answer your previous question, Jason is letting me know that the current FTEs are at 365.
Okay, versus 371. Okay, great.
Right.
Thank you.
So thanks, Jason. So this is the conclusion of the budget slide deck. And so does anyone have any other questions about the budget?
I do, Andrea. This is Jeff. So we're assuming a full utilization of the COVID funds of 5.1 million, I believe, to offset the budget loss.
So that's not quite a full utilization of the funds. The next part of our conversation, we'll get more into the how we're using the funds. But
Okay, yes. So then just a couple other little comments or thoughts, questions. How much of a student decline did we have for fiscal 2019? Do we know that number? Was that 16%, John?
No,
When
so
COVID
so
hit, it was a
so
20.
current fiscal year, right? So we're in fiscal year 20. We're
Mhm.
cumulatively about down 18% from the year
Okay.
prior. The year prior, 19, if I'm not mistaken, we arrested the enrollment decline. We were actually up like a percentage or something like that.
Okay.
The challenge on that is we were down the year before that, fiscal year 18, like 8% or something.
Yep.
So there was actually, if you look at it, the sort of floor, if you will, that we thought we found may have been a false floor.
Right. I can recall that now. I understand that.
Yeah, Jeff, you're hitting on a good point. I think we should have those enrollment, figures kind of in front of us, but it's not a bad idea to have it even in an appendix, just so we can always, understand, because that really drives a lot of our conversations in terms of how we need to support. But that's a good point, Jeff.
Yeah. Thanks, Mac. And one other last thing is, I did review the budget a number of times, and I keep going back to the facilities, the budget with IT, et cetera, trying to get a better understanding as to what we actually have to spend. We have 3.1 million for facilities and CapEx budget. We got to get our arms around exactly what is being spent, how far along it's spent. Is it something that out of that budget we could cut back in case the enrollment declines to 16%? I'm trying to find where the variables are in the budget to address an increase from 7.6 to 16%. Don't expect the full answer. I'm just pointing it out. I think that's a topic for another discussion.
Sure, that's a good point. And just at the last meeting, we had Deb Avery kind of teed up to present and didn't get a chance to get to that. So we can bring her back another time to sort of dig into the details around the facilities projects. And then, that it's always something that we can look at if we have financial issues. So it's a good point.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the projects, and what Jeff is hitting on is the actual spend flow, because we had 3.1 every year. We've got carryover. We didn't spend it all. Now we're adding another 1.7 for IT. It's like, okay, well, what's happening with all the money, right? So
yeah.
So it's project and cash flow.
Yeah, and I just as a side note, and I want to keep this meeting moving, I would be happy to play a role in that, working with facilities and you, Andrea, on looking at that on behalf of the board to really get our arms around what that means over a 3-year rolling period, maybe 2 years back, 2 years forward, to really get our arms around what we have to spend, what we're budgeted for, and do we have the cash to pay for it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's great. We're actually getting ready to sort of take a new look at the next 5 years, and so that's good timing.
Okay.
I think
Great.
we're in year 4, 3 or 4. We're sort of into the last 5-year plan, and it's time to reevaluate the next 5 years. And I think one of Deb's points is that things are changing all the time. We think we're going to do something else comes up as a priority. So how can we do the things that are most important and also be flexible as time goes on? So welcome your input there.
No, I think that, Jeff, from that perspective, that next 5-year strategic plan is on the horizon, and that's front burner. So really would appreciate, and I welcome the help from you, Jeff. So thank you.
Totally agree. Thank you, Jeff.
No problem.
Great. With that, any other questions on fiscal year 22 budget development and assumptions? Okay, can we have someone read the motion?
Yeah, I don't mind reading it. That the Springfield Technical Community College Board of Trustees Committee on Ways and Means, pursuant to the provision of Section 22, Chapter 15A, recommends the approval of the FY 2022 college spending plan in the FY 2022 trust budget fund budgets, and further authorize the president of the college and/or his designees to take any and all prudent steps necessary to award contracts for capital projects.
Great. Thank you, Mary Kate. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And Nene, can you take the roll on approval?
Yes, Mary Kate Murin,
Yes.
Max Starks,
Yes.
Vicky Kraus, Maurice Lindsay,
Yes.
Jeff Sattler,
Yes.
Janae McDonald. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nene. And thank you all. So now moving to federal COVID relief funding. Andrea.
Yes. So if we could advance past these few slides here. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is a follow-up to the discussion from last week. So what we want to do tonight is really just make sure everyone's on the same page about what the funds are, how we can use the funds, what our approach is to using the funds this year. And then what we did was put together the questions that we heard from this committee and our internal questions. And we've asked our auditors at O'Connor and Drew to help us with a Q&A at the end of this short presentation. So I think in case questions come up as we're going through the slides, I just want to introduce the auditors right now. So we have Lisa DeGiusto, Nelia Kruger, and Mike Cosgrove with us. And so I'm sure you see them on the screen there. And so there might be questions you have for them before we get to sort of the Q&A piece, and feel free to ask questions as we go. So if we can just go to the next slide, please. So we saw this slide last time. There is a difference, though, between this week and last week. So one of the questions that came up last week was, what if we don't get the American Rescue Plan funds? And again, just so this on this slide, we can see that we actually have specific numbers for those funds. The day after the meeting, so I think last Tuesday, we did get the notification from the Department of Ed that what exactly the funds are going to be. And then today I think it's today we got our award notices. So that question has been resolved at least. So we can see here that between the CARES Act, the CARISA funds, and the ARP funds, all, by the way, under this HERF umbrella, the total student aid that we've had and will get totals about $11 million, and the institutional funds total about $15.5 million. So this is just to give everyone a snapshot of what those funds are. And the rest of our conversation will be not about the student funds, but about the institutional funds. So if we can go to the next slide, please.
Hey, Andrew, before you move on, I think the point at the last meeting wasn't about whether we would get the fund, we could get the funds or not. It was more, would we be able to justify the actions to actually receive the funds? So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yes, that was really the point. So we felt comfortable that that about $7 million was what was going to be available to us. The question was, it sounded as if we felt like we would have difficulty justifying COVID-related actions that would drive the need for the $7 million. Therefore, we might not get the $7 million. That was really the point around receiving the funds or not. Right.
We'll address those other questions as we go along. This is really just letting you know that the funds, we have received the official notice about getting that funding.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear for that. I know all the committee members weren't at last week's meetings. That's to make sure that they were clear on what the point was. So it wasn't about, are we going to get $7 million? It was more about, $7 million is a bogey out there, but we might not get that because we might not be able to justify it. I just want to make sure they're clear on that. Okay.
Great. So just a few words about allowable uses of the funds and timing. So here's just kind of a quick overview of what the allowable uses are. So we can use the funds for direct COVID-related expenses that are incremental to our normal expenses. So things like testing and cleaning that cost money, we use the funds for those expenses. There are also direct COVID-related expenses that are already in the budget. Things like some payroll expenses, some technology expenses, that we otherwise would have in our budget, but they're also allowable expenses for use with the funds. And so those, when we spend the money in that way, that goes right to the bottom line. In addition to that, we can use the funds to offset lost revenue. And that's, a calculation that we will need to do, but the auditors can help us with that as well. But if you have questions, but that, again, when we calculate lost revenue, that goes right to the bottom line. And then we can also take an indirect % of the payroll, of the COVID-related payroll expenses. And so those are some of the allowable uses that we've incorporated into our planning here. There were also questions about timing. And one of the things I just wanted to be clear about is that each award that we get has a beginning date and an end date for using the funds. And then we can often get a no-cost extension to extend the time period within which we can use the funds. But to be clear, the availability of the funds does not coincide with our fiscal years. So for instance, if we have an award that with a start date of January 21 and an end date of January 22, some of those funds will be used in 21, some 22, or we could use it all in 21. So just to clarify that our sort of artificial timeline of a fiscal year doesn't necessarily coincide with the timing of the funding award timelines, if that makes sense. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that in case there was some. I think that some of the examples that I gave last time might have given the impression that the award, the timing within which we needed to use the awards was connected to our fiscal years, but it is not. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, it seemed like you're right, Andrew, and I'm glad. Thank you for that clarification. But it seemed like our ability to access the funds was contingent upon a fiscal year starting, and basically what you're saying is that's not the case. It just
Right.
Gotcha. Yep. Thank you.
All right. So we can go to the next slide. So here I just really wanted to cover, like, what are our priorities with respect to these funds? So the first priority is to cover all the incremental COVID-related expenses like testing and cleaning. We also have to meet certain additional grant requirements that are not extensive, but we do need to pay attention to those. So those two things are really, baseline, like off the top of the funding. And then for us, we have a priority of balancing our FY22 budget. And we've talked about that already plenty, with that $5.1 million of COVID funding being used to balance the 22 budget. Another priority is maximizing STCC control of the funds. So, and we talked about last time how it's going to be easier to identify allowable uses in FY21 versus 23. And then the question is, how can we maximize the use of the funds and by putting them into, by putting any excess revenue over expenses into reserves, that gives us more control over the funds. And the other thing we're really trying to do is buy time to develop sustainability strategies, because understanding that this year our baseline budget had a $5 million deficit. If we look out into the future, maybe there's some improvement, maybe not, but that we're not looking at balanced budgets without this funding if we do things the same way. So we're going to need to come up with strategies for having a balanced budget going forward without the funds, and having these funds in reserves will buy us some time to be able to make smart decisions and not make quick decisions, just for FY23. So our approach really to addressing these priorities is to maximize the allowable recognition of the COVID funds in FY21. And when we looked at the numbers a little closer over the last week, the current estimate looks like it will be between $4 and $5 million that we should bring into revenue in this fiscal year. And that will allow us to build our reserves. It'll put the money in the bank for the college, and it will not then be subject to any evolving sort of specifications or regulations related to the funding that's not in our control. So that's our recommendation. We know that there were a lot of questions. So
yeah, Andrew, this is a good time for the auditors, question for the auditors, because
yes.
the point here was essentially right now we're looking at a $3.1 million surplus in our fiscal year 2021 financials. And essentially what we're saying here is we're going to pull in $4 to $5 million of reserves, but we don't have a case to show where we have a deficit, right, outside of the $5 million we're looking at for 2022. So the question for the auditors is, optically, is that something that is appropriate for a move for us, or do we wait until we get to fiscal year 2022, then draw on the funds, because we can certainly make the case for them?
So my name is Nelia. I'm just real quick. I work at O'Connor and Drew. I'm one of the HERF, I guess, experts, you would say. I deal with a lot of the schools and the HERF stuff. So just to clarify, Mike and Lisa are your actual engagement team members. I just assist them kind of behind the scenes. So to answer your question, I do understand what you're saying about the optics of it. However, the issue is that the optics don't relate to the actual federal funding or the Department of Education's, I guess, intention for your use of that funding. NACUBO has also kind of reiterated the point that when you take something down like lost revenue, you've already lost the revenue. It's gone. The fact that you've received savings from that does not relate to the fact that you lost that revenue, and the department wants to reimburse you for that lost revenue. It just so happens that in this one particular year, you will be showing a surplus, but the department isn't taking that into account in any way, shape, or form. So I understand what you're saying. Like, the average Joe may look at your financials and say, well, they're taking all this money. They don't need to. But in reality, the Department of Education has come out and said, yes, you do need to, because you lost revenue. You had to change your way of doing business. And this money has been allocated, and this is our way of getting that money to you, not only for the here and the now, where you have already lost that revenue, but also when the funding is gone, when you have nothing else and you're kind of left to figure out, what do we do now that maybe COVID's getting better, and you're trying to pull students back into school who may not be able to, or can't, or don't want to, or whatever the case is, to kind of help you the next couple of years. So it's almost like all these allowable costs are just a mechanism to release the funding to you. Once you've jumped that hurdle and the funding is yours, it's yours to, I guess, do what you will, which in most cases, the Department of Education is trusting that most schools, if not all schools, will take that money and reinvest it in their students and reinvest it in the future of education at your school.
Okay. No, it does make sense. And are we required to show that we lost revenue or had expenses over and above to the tune of $4 to $5 million, or we just say we need $4 to $5 million? What's that process look like?
So, like Andrea mentioned, there's a couple of different ways you can. It's almost like this. They've allocated the funding to you, so it's basically sitting in their account, ready for you whenever you can go over the hurdles required. So, if you decide that you want to use it for lost revenue, the hurdle for lost revenue is basically coming up with a calculation that shows, and they give you so much freedom, because the Department of Education has come out with a very detailed sort of lost revenue FAQ. They give you several different methodologies that you can use to say, you can look at year over year, you've lost revenue. You can look at it looking at a 3-year average, a 5-year average. You can look at it semester by semester. They really want to give schools the freedom to say what methodology best fits your school, best represents your school, to show that you had lost revenue. There are some intricacies to it where, for example, if your, let's say your typical enrollment decline is 2%, and year over year, it went down 20%, well, you lost revenue of 18%. So you take that percentage, you figure out what that amount would be for lost revenue, and that's the amount you can take down from the hurdle you've now gone over, releasing that funding. Now you can draw down the physical funding from the Department of Education. And that calculation is really judgment from the school. As long as it follows the clear methodology, it has proper documentation, you have the information behind it, that is all the department is looking at. And they, as of right now, aren't going school to school to look at that. They're relying on us, the third-party auditors, to do that work when we do the single audit work. So that's kind of, we kind of had these discussions with Andrea and her team to kind of look at what their plan was to draw down, in this case, based on lost revenue, to say, okay, does this methodology make sense? And is this the most appropriate methodology? And I believe it was mentioned in the previous meeting, once you pick a methodology, you kind of stick with it throughout all the different HERF iterations. So not only do you have to look, okay, how can I get the most money right now with this methodology, but can this methodology be used again? And that was one of the conversations, because looking at it year over year, yes, that might be great, because you might have had a pretty good 2020, 2021 tanks because no one came to school or couldn't, or whatever the case is. But then if you believe your 2022 is going to bounce back, well, lost revenue is not going to be the best hurdle for you to use to release funding.
Right, right.
And I guess touching a little bit on what Andrea was saying is, that's, I think, one of the concerns is you kind of want to get as much as you can now with the information that you have, instead of relying on a future event that may or may not occur, that then becomes more difficult for you to pull that funding down.
Right, that makes sense. So based upon what you've seen for methodology or approach and what the estimate says, you're comfortable with the $4 to $5 million estimate?
So as Andrea mentioned, that $4 to $5 million estimate is made up of several, I guess, buckets.
Mm-hmm.
So we looked at lost revenue, and the methodology, as far as we could tell from what we had, I mean, obviously when we go to test it, we'll get, I mean, full backup and really go into the details. But from our conversations, we felt confident that the calculation was correct and proper. As far as payroll, we had that discussion as well. Some of that money it can be drawn down through payroll. Again, we went through kind of our understanding of the regulations, what's been out there, what's been allowed, how some of our clients have already pulled down the funding using payroll. And your methodology, again, doesn't vary from anything we've seen or recommended ourselves, or NACUBO has recommended. And I'm trying to think, the incremental COVID is just, that's like the easiest one. So
right, that should be right.
That's the easiest one. And then again, indirect, the Department of Education in their FAQs specifically addressed that matter and said 100% if you have a negotiated indirect rate with the department or with HHS or whoever your cognizant agency is, you're absolutely allowed to use the funding for indirect, as you would with any federal grant that you would normally engage within a federal agency with. So I'm trying to think if there was any other ones. I think those are the major buckets that we had discussed, and we went through them each in detail, and it was appropriate in our eyes.
Excellent, great, thank you for the background.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Nelia. Do we want to just move forward to the next two slides? Kind of have other questions that I think Nelia has answered some of them, and I just want to see these are really some of the questions that came out of the last meeting. People should just jump in if they have, if committee members have questions, or we can kind of go through these and see, kind of pick from these, depending on what your questions are. So I think I'll just kind of put it back to the committee to see what are the questions that you'd like to have answered.
Yeah, and Andrea, this is Jeff.
Yes.
A long question. I have to jump off. I'll be on the phone. I have a 6 o'clock hard meeting, but it comes to me that we have 15.5 million that we say it's approved. and we can use those funds. It seems to me that we're receiving the funds, but have to justify the use post receipt and keep our liquidity through 2023. We know where 21's looking. We're budgeting 22 with a loss. We got to come out of this 3 years from now and not be stupid when it comes to this 15.5 million and how we use it. My question basically is, looking at the liquidity for this year needed to, or excess that we have, and 5 million next year that we're going to use from this COVID monies that will justify in some way, shape, or form working with our auditors. I have no problem with that. I'd rather be spending and receiving the money today to keep the college alive and worry about what 24 looks like. And hopefully we get student enrollment back and we get more stability. But I really think you have to really think this through from a cash flow standpoint through 2023, let alone 22. With that in mind, and that's why I went back to the CapEx budget, whatever cash we can save and have a surplus in 23, wonderful. And if we justify it through our auditors of what we use the money for, whether it's loss of student enrollment, et cetera, we keep the cash and move on for another day and still have that liquidity. Is that an appropriate assessment of what we're looking at here?
I would say so, yes. I mean, I think it's a matter at this point of let's recognize that revenue now. Let's get the cash now, put it in the bank, and then we have control of those funds instead of being subject to, if we wait until later to justify, or to find allowable uses for the funds, it might be harder to find those allowable uses later. So even though we know we will need money in FY23, better to have it in the bank now so it's available later versus wait to try to pull it down later.
Yes.
So that's the strategy.
Okay, because that relates to the 7.5 decline in enrollment versus a possible guess 16%. That's $1.7 million. We have the liquidity to keep the college alive, even if we misjudged the lack of enrollment for 22's budget.
Exactly.
Okay, I understand it. Thank you.
Thank you. So what other, do we want to go through this list of questions, or do you want to just choose from the list as, depending on what your questions are at this point?
I think the questions on the first page have already been addressed. The first bullet on the second slide, again, that's been addressed as well. I hit that one with the optics over having a surplus. Other institutions, that Nelly addressed that as well. This is consistent with other institutions. And the last point was really around the getting caught between fiscal year usage of at the last meeting that we were talking about. It seemed like it was more connected to the actual fiscal years as opposed to being able to draw down regardless of fiscal year. So I think these questions that you have listed here have pretty much all been addressed, right? But ultimately, what we wanted to make sure was that what seemed to be a not strong comfort in being able to use the funds, not being able to justify use of the funds, and then having a surplus today and being able to draw down funds. And how do you take a $3 million surplus and then add to it? We wanted to make sure we were taking the right approach, which is why we asked the auditors to be here. So I think with their comments, and they're looking at the data and walking through the methodologies that you all have used. And I was looking at the nodding of heads as Jeff kind of summarized, kind of what he was thinking. I think from my perspective, I'm comfortable, with the approach, and understanding better now the 2022 alone budget. The last meeting it got too commingled in terms of 22 versus what was happening here, which never should have been. So there are a lot of stuff that happened at the last meeting, but I think from my perspective, at least, that's all been resolved during this discussion. Any other questions anyone has?
I think Mac, you're correct. That's where we're holding up, having a hold up there with Vicky on those very things that you just analyzed there carefully. And I too, I'm very comfortable hearing from the auditors and get that all clarified. So I think that those questions from last time has been answered. I'm comfortable.
Thank you, Maurice.
And
Any other
Mac, if I could
questions?
say one more thing quickly about the timing. I know you were saying about the optics. There is some reassurance that the Department of Ed is A-OK with how you are proceeding with the funding, and they're not drawing down, going through the hurdles. Also, the MD&A within the financials can be used as an opportunity to let your reader know, there is a surplus, there will be a surplus, and here are how the funds are planned to be used to benefit the student, benefit the school in future years, and kind of use that as your way to tell the public that, yes, we may have a surplus in this one year, this one snapshot of a time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's, indicative of how you're running the business and how you're going to run the business and how the future is going to be for you and your school. So
Excellent. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, yeah. Again, we never thought that things weren't above board, but we just wanted to make sure that we were clear. Because it came to us almost as if, came to me, I should say, even before the meeting, almost as if, we as trustees were approving this approach. And I didn't think that was appropriate. We approve an overall budget, and then we have a good understanding for how funds are going to be used. So we wanted to make sure that we had clarity on and again, you guys coming in and adding, to this helps. So we just wanted to make sure that we had clarity on the thinking that's going into this. And again, from my perspective, I'm much more comfortable now than I was last week. Excellent. So any other questions, comments?
This is Jeff. One last comment. I'm on the phone right now since I'm going to a 6 meeting, but I didn't want to. I still think that, again, looking at a 2 to 3 year cash flow projection or whatever it might be, the amount of funds we need versus the amount of CapEx expenditure we are thinking we're going to provide, I think there is not enough information to be comfortable to know in 2023 where we think our liquidity is going to be outside of us projecting on what our CapEx need is going to be. You know where I'm coming from on that?
Yep, I'm totally with you. Yep, I'm with you. So, and definitely appreciate your help with the team in terms of building that kind of 5-year projection. So, definitely looking forward to that.
Yep. Yeah, I know it can't happen overnight. It's probably in a few months or something like that, maybe into September. But getting into the 22 budget for all trustees to understand that, I think will be given a lot more comfort knowing what our cash flow is going to look like, let alone, profitability or loss.
Absolutely right. Yep.
And I think, Jeff,
Thanks.
the last comment is you're 100% right, is that timing, I think, makes sense from into September, because that is our retreat. That would be the time for us to really kind of review some type of very high level draft of strategic plan from a CapEx perspective. So the timing's right there that we've been talking about.
Yep.
Excellent. Listen, thank you all, auditors. Thank you so much for joining the meeting. And again, to all you trustees and faculty for joining this actual meeting, the special meeting. I know it's another added to all of our plates, a lot going on, but thank you all. And with that, we'd like to take the roll to adjourn the meeting.
Yes. Mary Kate Murin,
Yes.
Max Starks,
Yes.
Vicki Krause, Maurice Lindsay,
Yes.
Jeff Sattler, and Janae McDonald.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeff.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you, Renee. Have a
Thank
great
you,
night.
everyone, very much.
Thanks. All right. Bye.
Have a good night.
Thank you.